Hello, welcome back to the channel. So for today's yapping session, we're going to be discussing who or which side was to blame for the Cold War. So the Cold War is a period of very high tension between the Western powers, be it the USA, and the Eastern powers, the Soviet Union and China on the other side. Now you're looking at a time frame. Some historians debate it, the foundations were laid slightly before, but you're looking at roughly 1945 to 1991. Now, simply enough, it's known as the Cold War because it never became a hot war. There was never any open conflict between the two sides. They fought numerous proxy wars, but it never divulged into an actual hot conflict per se, hence being known as the Cold War. Now, going back to the investigation at hand, who was to blame? Perspectives on this have changed over time, basically. So historians are always reinventing the way they look at things, based on new evidence and just attitudes at the time. So not only am I going to walk you through each of the perspectives, we're going to talk a bit about why that perspective was held at the time, basically. So the initial theory, held by Western historians is known as like the orthodox or the traditionalist viewpoint. This viewpoint was around from the 1940s up until the end of the 1950s, early 1960s. And basically the viewpoint held that the USSR was entirely to blame for the Cold War. Now, this viewpoint developed because of the context of the time. It was, at the height, the early height, it was the historians at the time were writing in the Cold War. There was also elements of like McCarthyism going around. It was the idea that, if you were ever to present a viewpoint, a perspective that was sympathetic towards the Russians, you would be labeled a communist yourself. You'd be investigated, in theory, at risk of losing your job. So it was a very dangerous time to ever, show any sympathy towards the communists. And of course, at the same time, they only had access to Western sources that the Western governments had published. So it was natural in the time period that, it was going to be a viewpoint that was more critical of the USSR. And so the blame primarily comes from the Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe. They were, as the Red Army had kicked the Russians out of Eastern Europe, naturally the forces had stayed there basically and occupied. And Stalin had gone about installing pro-Soviet communist governments in these countries. And the Western powers blamed the Russians for this. They'd understood at both Yalta and Potsdam that they thought that the Russians were going to, whilst they acknowledged a sphere of influence, they didn't think there would actually be a Red Army presence left over in these countries. And so that was naturally a cause of tension. On top of this, you had the belief that communism was going to spread. And by 1950, the domino theory, the idea of the communism spreading, was actually did hold weight, because in 1949 you had Mao taking over China. Communism was spreading to Asia. There was the insurgency against the French in Indochina, and it did look like that communism was really at risk of spreading. You had the civil war in Greece, in which communists were trying to take over there. And it is an idea that held weight at the time. The Western powers would look at this and see it as a risk, and so that is obviously naturally going to create tension amongst the Western powers. And more importantly, the Western historians are going to report on that tension, aren't they? Finally, I would argue Stalin's actions as well contributed to this. I couldn't break down every single one of them in the time frame we have, but I think actions like the Berlin blockade showed that Stalin was an aggressive leader that had to be dealt with in turn, basically. And naturally, it's going to lead towards Western historians blaming the Soviet Union for this period of tension. So moving on from the traditionalist viewpoint, we come on to what was known as the revisionists. And so the revisionists, the time frame for these guys is roughly about 1960s to mid to late 1980s, basically. And so these historians were obviously born. They're a younger breed of historians. Born born during the Cold War, but they're writing in a period of growing anti-US sentiment. So we're thinking, is at the height of the Vietnam War, you've got the hippie movement emerging, And there was just a greater confidence around critiquing the USA in the time period. It becomes, I wouldn't say more common, it becomes almost fashionable at the time to be anti-US. And so these historians look at it from a viewpoint that the USA wasn't this victim, and so naturally they point it towards they point the blame on the US. This branch of historians do. The reason they blame the US primarily stems from the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. So the traditionalists viewed the Marshall Plan more as the economic aid to the Western powers. They viewed it more as a response to the risk of communism spreading. But the revisionists see it as they call it dollar imperialism. They see the US is using its economic power to try and spread influence, to try and spread capitalism, and they see it as a more aggressive approach as opposed to the containment that the traditionalists believed in. And so that's the first critique. Truman and the nuclear bomb also get a share of the blame. And the argument is, had the US been entirely, open to the idea of, continued relations with the US, had they never had any hostile intentions towards the USSR, then why wouldn't they have shared the information on the nuclear bomb with anyone? They kept it from the British, they kept it from the Russians, and it's just the argument was they were trying to maintain a position of strength over the other powers in exchange of maintaining a friendly relationship with them, and so they get critiqued for that. You also just have Truman's antagonistic nature towards Stalin. He's a much more staunch anti-communist, and he just showed he was much less willing to work with Stalin. There was the idea as well that when Truman informed Stalin about the nuclear bomb at the Potsdam Conference, that he did it in like an antagonistic way, and it's just, he didn't help relations at all. Another critique predates 1945 that the revisionists bring up against the Western powers is how delayed the opening of the Western Front was in the Second World War. So Stalin had been calling for a new front to be opened against the Germans, and they'd been fighting in North Africa, but it was always a bit of a sideshow. Stalin needed serious Allied forces in France to take Germans away from the Eastern Front, and the Allies argued they needed time to prepare, but they were very much dragging their feet with this. They left Stalin hanging for 3 years on his own before opening up this front. And so naturally Stalin is critical of this. He sees it as an attempt to bleed the Soviet Union of forces for a future Cold War, or for a potential hot war as well, basically. So that leads to increased tension as well, okay? I would also say that Stalin naturally has reason to be hesitant about working with the Allied powers, because in the build-up to the Second World War, how they very clearly tried to direct Hitler towards him, with the policy of appeasement, with the non-intervention committee in Spain, with the Munich conference. They in every attempt they had, left Stalin out in an attempt to get Stalin and Hitler to fight each other first, avoiding them. So Stalin's naturally going to look at them with suspicion and an element of, I would argue, cowardice. They had tried to shirk out of stopping Hitler. They had tried to put the responsibility on him, and so naturally he's going to have sort of hostile feelings towards them because of these actions that they've done. Anyway, moving on to the final viewpoint, the post-revisionists. So the post-revisionists, this idea materializes around 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot more, really, but basically previously there was basically nothing. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of documents are leaked or published about, from the time period, but from the Russian perspective now. And so it for the first time let Western historians actually compare and contrast both sides of the debate, basically, but from the perspective of the Soviets as well. And basically, the post-revisionists put the blame on everyone. They argue it was almost not nobody's fault, but everybody's fault at the same time. And so I won't dive too much into this one, but they blame it on ideology. You have the classic capitalism and communism debate that these two competing ideologies were never going to be able to survive alongside each other, and so naturally tension came of that. You can't place the blame on either side. It's just the nature of the two teams, and they also blame it on like miscommunications between the two groups. So, for example, at the Yalta and Potsdam, there had been the belief. So Stalin claimed he was going to provide free elections for the countries in Eastern Europe, but the Soviet and Western ideas of democracy were very different. Stalin believed, he gave the Eastern Europeans free elections to vote for who they wanted in the Communist Party, so a single party election, but they could elect their representatives. From his perspective, that's what he called free elections, Whereas the Westerners, particularly Churchill, believed it was going to be like Western-style multi-party democracy. And the belief is the tension comes though because they never ironed out the exactly what Eastern Europe was going to look like after the war, basically. And it's through these miscommunications that the tension arises, basically. And so the post-revisionists spin it that way, that it was nobody's fault, basically. It was just a complete mixture of both sides miscommunicating and the natural, their nature that led to the conflict. And so in terms of which one I agree with, I think post-revisionist is a bit too safe, but it's a mix. It's a complete mixture. I'm not going to say I'm a Stalin fanboy because it's not true. I am sympathetic towards Stalin's foreign policy. I think in the build-up to World War II, he was one of the only leaders that was willing to try and stop Hitler. Stop fascism in general. He was one of the only people vocally speaking up against Mussolini and Hitler and their expansionism. He actively tried to stop the rise of fascism in Spain with Franco, and I believe had he been offered an alliance from the British or French, he would never have signed the Nazi-Soviet pact and would have been willing to fight Germany. And it's on that basis that I'm sympathetic to him. I feel he was left out to dry a little bit. They wanted the Nazis and Soviets to fight it out and nothing to do with it. And so I think I actually do fall more on I very much see the point with post-revisionism. I think I fall on the revisionist. I largely want to blame the USA. Obviously, but I appreciate all of the debates. It's an interesting one. I see the strengths. But that's generally where I tend to fall on this issue. I think in an element of post-revisionism, no side was innocent, but I think largely the Western powers didn't help themselves, be it in the build-up to World War II, their involvement in the Russian Civil War, and just their actions with the nuclear bomb as well. So that's where I fall in the debate. We've gone a bit longer than I'd wanted to, so I'm going to wrap this up quickly. Like I said, any other topics you fancy seeing, drop it in the comments. If you have any thoughts on who you would blame for the Cold War, drop it in the comments. I'll happily carry on the debate. Typing it up. But no, otherwise, thank you for watching.